Imagine discovering that your children, whom you've supported and nurtured for decades, are more interested in their inheritance than your well-being. Picture realizing that the fortune you've built has become a barrier to genuine connection, and that your twilight years might be spent in gilded isolation. Now envision a young physiotherapist entering your life, bringing hope and companionship, only to reveal her true motives are far from pure. How would you react? Would you resign yourself to a lonely existence, or would you use your wisdom and resources to teach a profound lesson about the true meaning of family and wealth? This is the story of Edward Blackwell, a 75-year-old millionaire who decides to shake the very foundations of his family's values. The grandfather clock in the grand foyer of Oakwood Manor chimed 9 times, its deep, resonant tones echoing through the cavernous halls of the Connecticut mansion. Edward Blackwell, aged 75, sat in his leather armchair by the bay window, his weathered hands resting on an intricately carved mahogany cane. His eyes, once a vibrant blue but now faded to a stormy gray, gazed out at the meticulously manicured gardens that stretched as far as the eye could see. The sprawling estate, with its Palladian architecture and century-old oak trees, stood as a testament to the Blackwell family's enduring legacy. Yet for Edward, it had become a gilded cage, a constant reminder of what he'd lost and what he'd never truly had. "Will that be all for the evening, Mr. Blackwell?" Mary's gentle voice broke through his reverie. The elderly governess stood in the doorway, her silver hair neatly pinned back, her kind eyes watching him with a mixture of concern and affection. Edward turned slowly, offering a wan smile. "Yes, thank you, Mary. You've outdone yourself as always." Mary nodded, hesitating for a moment before speaking again. "Mr. William called earlier. He asked if you'd like him to come by this weekend." A flicker of genuine warmth passed over Edward's face. "William? Yes, of course. Tell him I'd be delighted." As Mary left the room, Edward's gaze fell on the ornate silver picture frame on the side table. It held a photograph of a strikingly beautiful woman with auburn hair and a dazzling smile. Madeline, his late wife, gone now for over a decade. He reached out, his fingers trembling slightly as they traced the outline of her face. "Oh, Maddie," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "What would you make of all this?" The silence that followed was deafening. Edward closed his eyes, allowing the memories to wash over him. He could almost hear the laughter of his children echoing through the halls, smell the aroma of Madeline's favorite perfume lingering in the air. But when he opened his eyes, he was met with the stark reality of his solitude. The Blackwell fortune, amassed over generations and significantly expanded by Madeline's shrewd investments, had been both a blessing and a curse. It had provided a life of luxury and opportunity, but it had also created a chasm between Edward and his 5 children. They had scattered across the country, pursuing their own ambitions, rarely finding time to call, let alone visit. Edward's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Helen, the cook, entered carrying a silver tray with a steaming cup of chamomile tea. "Thought you might like a cuppa before bed, Mr. Blackwell," she said, her Boston accent a stark contrast to the refined tones that usually echoed through the mansion. "Thank you, Helen. You're too kind." Edward accepted the cup gratefully, inhaling the soothing aroma. Helen lingered, her round face creased with concern. "Begging your pardon, sir, but you haven't been eating much lately. Is there something special you'd like me to prepare for tomorrow?" Edward shook his head. "No need to fuss, Helen. Your cooking is exemplary as always. I'm just not as hungry as I used to be." Helen nodded, unconvinced but unwilling to push further. As she turned to leave, Edward called out, "Helen, do you remember the apple pie Madeline used to make, with the cinnamon crust?" A smile spread across Helen's face. "Of course, sir. Mrs. Blackwell's secret recipe. Would you like me to try my hand at it?" "Please," Edward said softly. "I'd like that very much." As the door closed behind Helen, Edward sipped his tea, lost in thought. The mansion, once a hub of activity and warmth, now felt like a mausoleum. The silence was broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock and the occasional creak of the old house settling. Edward's gaze wandered to the family portrait hanging above the fireplace. It had been painted nearly 20 years ago, when the children were still young and the future seemed bright with promise. Now it served as a painful reminder of what had been lost. There was Elizabeth, the eldest, now a high-powered attorney in New York City. She called dutifully on holidays, but always seemed distracted, her mind already on the next case or client. Then came the twins, Michael and Christopher, both successful in their own right. Michael a surgeon in Boston, Christopher a tech entrepreneur in Silicon Valley. They sent expensive gifts on his birthday, but rarely found time to visit. Sarah, the artistic one, had moved to Paris to pursue her passion for painting. Her occasional letters were filled with vivid descriptions of the city of light, but they only served to highlight the distance between them. And finally there was Thomas, the youngest, who had followed in his mother's footsteps and become a financial whiz. He managed a hedge fund in Chicago and seemed to view every interaction through the lens of potential profit or loss. Edward sighed heavily, setting down his empty teacup. He couldn't help but wonder where he had gone wrong. Had he been too focused on providing for his family materially, neglecting the emotional bonds that truly mattered? Or had the very wealth he'd worked so hard to maintain created a sense of entitlement that had driven his children away? The sound of footsteps in the hallway roused Edward from his melancholy thoughts. A moment later, William, his 23-year-old grandson, appeared in the doorway, a broad smile lighting up his face. "Grandpa," William exclaimed, crossing the room in a few quick strides to embrace Edward. "I hope you don't mind me dropping by unannounced. I was in the area and thought I'd surprise you." Edward's face broke into a genuine smile, the first one in days. "William, my boy, you know you're always welcome here." William pulled up a chair, his youthful energy a stark contrast to the room's somber atmosphere. "How are you doing, Grandpa? Really?" Edward studied his grandson's face, seeing in it echoes of Madeline's warmth and his own determination. "I'm all right, William. Just feeling my age, I suppose." William's brow furrowed with concern. "Have you been getting out much? You know, there's a new cafe in town that does amazing scones. We could go there sometime if you'd like." "That sounds lovely," Edward said, though they both knew it was unlikely to happen. The thought of leaving the safety of Oakwood Manor, of facing the pitying glances of neighbors who remembered him as he once was almost unbearable. They chatted for a while, William filling the room with stories of his studies and his plans for the future. Edward listened intently, grateful for this connection to the world beyond his self-imposed isolation. As the evening wore on, William reluctantly stood to leave. "I've got an early class tomorrow, but I'll be back this weekend. Maybe we can play chess like we used to." Edward nodded, squeezing his grandson's hand. "I'd like that very much, William. Thank you for coming." After William left, the silence seemed even more oppressive. Edward struggled to his feet, leaning heavily on his cane as he made his way to the window. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the lawn. In the distance, he could see the lights of the nearby town, a reminder of the world that continued to turn beyond the gates of Oakwood Manor. As he stood there, contemplating the vast emptiness of his life, Edward was struck by a sudden, overwhelming longing for connection. He yearned for someone to talk to, someone who would see him as more than just a wealthy old man whiling away his final years. Little did Edward know that change was about to enter his life in the form of Addison Parker, a young physiotherapist who would arrive the next day. Recommended by his doctor to help with his increasing mobility issues, Addison would bring a breath of fresh air into the stagnant halls of Oakwood Manor. But with that change would come challenges and revelations that would shake the very foundations of Edward's world. As Edward finally retired to his bedroom, the house settling into its nightly silence, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the precipice of something momentous. Whether it would lead to redemption or ruin, only time would tell. The stage was set, the players were in motion, and the next chapter of Edward Blackwell's life was about to unfold in ways he could never have imagined. The morning sun filtered through the heavy curtains of Edward's bedroom, casting a warm glow across the antique furniture. As he slowly opened his eyes, the familiar ache in his joints reminded him of the day's upcoming appointment. Addison Parker, the new physiotherapist, was due to arrive in just a few hours. Edward eased himself out of bed, his movements slow and deliberate. As he made his way to the ensuite bathroom, he caught a glimpse of himself in the full-length mirror. The man staring back at him seemed a stranger, stooped shoulders, thinning silver hair, and eyes that had lost their youthful spark. He sighed, turning away from his reflection. "Mr. Blackwell?" Mary's voice called from the other side of the door. "Breakfast is ready whenever you are, and don't forget, Miss Parker is scheduled to arrive at 10 o'clock. "Thank you, Mary," Edward replied, his voice gravelly from sleep. "I'll be down shortly." As he dressed in his usual attire of pressed slacks and a crisp button-down shirt, Edward couldn't help but feel a twinge of anticipation. It had been so long since a new face had graced the halls of Oakwood Manor. Perhaps this Addison Parker would bring a welcome change to his monotonous routine. Downstairs, the dining room was bathed in sunlight. Helen had outdone herself, preparing a spread of fresh fruit, whole-grain toast, and poached eggs. As Edward took his seat at the head of the long mahogany table, he couldn't help but notice the empty chairs surrounding him. The silence was deafening. "Will that be all, Mr. Blackwell?" Helen asked, hovering nearby. Edward nodded, offering a small smile. "Yes, thank you, Helen, it looks wonderful." As he ate, Edward's mind wandered to the impending arrival of Miss Parker. He'd been resistant to the idea of a physiotherapist at first, viewing it as an admission of his declining health. But his doctor had been insistent, and William had gently encouraged him to give it a try. The doorbell chimed precisely at 10 o'clock. Edward heard Mary's footsteps in the foyer, followed by a murmur of voices. A moment later, she appeared in the doorway of the study where Edward had retreated after breakfast. "Mr. Blackwell, Miss Parker has arrived," Mary announced, stepping aside to reveal a young woman in her early 20s. Addison Parker was not what Edward had expected. With her vibrant red hair pulled back in a neat ponytail and a smile that seemed to light up the room, she exuded an energy that was almost palpable. She stepped forward, extending her hand. "Mr. Blackwell, it's a pleasure to meet you," she said, her voice warm and confident. "I'm Addison Parker." Edward stood leaning on his cane as he shook her hand. "Welcome to Oakwood Manor, Miss Parker. I hope you'll forgive an old man's skepticism about this whole endeavor." Addison's smile didn't falter. "I completely understand, Mr. Blackwell, but I promise you by the time we're done you'll be amazed at how much better you feel." There was something about her enthusiasm that was infectious. Despite himself, Edward found a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Well then, Miss Parker, let's see what you can do." Over the next few weeks, Addison became a regular fixture at Oakwood Manor. Her visits, initially scheduled for 3 times a week, soon became daily occurrences. Edward found himself looking forward to their sessions, not just for the physical relief they brought, but for the breath of fresh air Addison seemed to bring with her. During their therapy sessions, Addison would regale Edward with stories of her life outside the manor, her struggles as a young professional, her dreams of opening her own practice someday. Edward found himself opening up in return, sharing anecdotes from his own youth that he hadn't thought about in years. "You know, Mr. Blackwell," Addison said one day as she helped him through a series of stretches, "I bet you were quite the heartbreaker in your day." Edward chuckled, a sound that had become more frequent since Addison's arrival. "Oh, I don't know about that, although there was this one time in college." As Edward launched into a story about a spring dance and a case of mistaken identity, he felt a warmth in his chest that had been absent for far too long. It felt good to laugh, to remember the man he used to be. Addison's influence extended beyond their therapy sessions. She encouraged Edward to venture out into the gardens, to feel the sun on his face and the breeze in his hair. She brought books on topics they'd discussed, leaving them casually on side tables for Edward to discover. Slowly but surely, she was breathing life back into the dusty corners of Oakwood Manor. One sunny afternoon, as they sat on the terrace after a particularly successful session, Addison broached a subject that had been on her mind. "Mr. Blackwell," she began, her tone careful, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but I've noticed that you don't seem to have many visitors. Don't you have family nearby?" Edward's face clouded over, the joy of the afternoon dissipating like mist in the sun. "My children, they have their own lives now. They're very busy, you see." Addison leaned forward, her green eyes filled with sympathy. "That must be so difficult for you. Family is so important." "Yes, well," Edward said, his voice gruff with emotion. "Sometimes things don't work out the way we hope." Addison reached out, placing her hand on Edward's arm. "You know, Mr. Blackwell, I've come to think of you as more than just a patient. I hope you know that you can always talk to me if you need to." Edward patted her hand, touched by her concern. "Thank you, my dear. You've been a bright spot in an old man's life." As the weeks turned into months, Edward found himself relying more and more on Addison's company. She began staying later after their sessions, joining him for dinner or a game of chess. Edward even found himself sharing details about his financial affairs, something he'd always kept closely guarded. "It's just so much to manage sometimes," he confided one evening over a glass of brandy. "The investments, the properties. I worry about what will happen to it all when I'm gone." Addison listened intently, her brow furrowed in concentration. Have you considered setting up a trust? Or perhaps adjusting your will to ensure everything is taken care of? Edward raised an eyebrow, surprised by her knowledge. You seem quite well versed in these matters, Miss Parker. Addison laughed, a slight flush coloring her cheeks. Oh, I've picked up a few things here and there. My father was in finance, you see. As Addison's presence in Edward's life grew, others began to take notice. William, during his weekend visits, observed the change in his grandfather with a mixture of pleasure and concern. You seem happier, Grandpa, William remarked one Saturday as they played chess in the library. Miss Parker has been good for you, I think. Edward nodded, moving his knight across the board. She's been a great help indeed. It's nice to have someone to talk to. William hesitated, then said, I'm glad you have her, Grandpa. I hope you're being careful, you know, about sharing personal information and such. Edward's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. What exactly are you implying, William? William held up his hands in a placating gesture. Nothing, Grandpa. I just want to make sure you're protected, that's all. The conversation left Edward unsettled. He'd never given much thought to Addison's motives before, but now he found himself analyzing their interactions, looking for signs of ulterior motives. It was around this time that Alexa entered the picture. The young woman, barely out of college, had moved into the house next door to care for her ailing grandmother. Edward first met her one morning as he was taking one of his now regular walks in the garden. Oh, hello, Alexa called out, waving from over the fence. You must be Mr. Blackwell. I'm Alexa. I just moved in next door. Edward made his way over, leaning on his cane. Welcome to the neighborhood, my dear. How are you finding it so far? Alexa's face lit up. It's beautiful here, so peaceful. Although, I have to admit, I'm a bit out of my depth with all this gardening. Edward chuckled. Well, if you'd like some pointers, I'd be happy to share what I know. These old hands have tended these gardens for longer than you've been alive, I'd wager. From that day forward, Alexa became a frequent visitor to Oakwood Manor. She would often stop by in the evenings, eager to learn about gardening or simply to chat. Edward found her company refreshing. Her enthusiasm for life reminded him of Addison, but there was an openness to Alexa that was all her own. As Edward's circle expanded to include Alexa, he couldn't help but notice a subtle change in Addison's behavior. She seemed more possessive of his time, often finding reasons to extend their sessions or to stay for dinner. One evening, as Addison was preparing to leave after a particularly long day, she paused at the door. Mr. Blackwell, she said, her voice hesitant, I've been thinking about what you said about your concerns for the future. Edward nodded, encouraging her to continue. Well, Addison went on, I was wondering if you'd ever considered, if you'd thought about including someone else in your will, someone who's been there for you, who understands your needs. The implication hung heavy in the air. Edward felt a chill run down his spine, William's words of caution echoing in his mind. I'll have to think about that, Miss Parker, he said, his voice carefully neutral. It's a big decision, you understand. Addison nodded quickly, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Of course. I just wanted you to know that I'm here for you no matter what. As Addison drove away that night, Edward stood at the window, watching her taillights disappear down the long driveway. For the first time since her arrival, he felt a sense of unease. The warmth and connection he'd felt with Addison now seemed tainted, leaving him questioning every interaction they'd had. Over the next few weeks, Edward found himself pulling away from Addison, making excuses to shorten their sessions or to skip them altogether. He spent more time with Alexa and William, finding comfort in their uncomplicated companionship. Addison, sensing the change, became more insistent. She began dropping hints about financial troubles, about how much she'd given up to dedicate herself to Edward's care. I just feel like we have such a special connection, she said one day, her eyes wide and imploring. Don't you think it would be nice if we could make it more official? Edward, his suspicions now fully aroused, decided it was time to take action. He called a meeting with his lawyer, updating his will and making some very specific arrangements. Then he put his plan into motion. At their next session, Edward greeted Addison with a grave expression. Miss Parker, he said, his voice heavy with false concern, I'm afraid I have some bad news. Addison's face immediately filled with worry. What is it, Mr. Blackwell? Are you all right? Edward shook his head slowly. It's not my health, my dear. It's my finances. I'm afraid I've suffered some significant losses. I may even have to sell Oakwood Manor." The change in Addison's expression was subtle but unmistakable, a flicker of disappointment, quickly masked by concern. "Oh, Mr. Blackwell, I'm so sorry to hear that. Is there anything I can do to help?" Edward waved her off. "No, my dear. These things happen. I just wanted you to know that I may not be able to continue our sessions for much longer. I'll need to make some cuts, you understand?" Addison nodded, her mind clearly racing. "Of course I understand, but please don't worry about my fees. I'm happy to continue our sessions, regardless of your financial situation." Edward smiled sadly. "That's very kind of you, Miss Parker. We'll see how things go." Over the next few weeks, Edward continued to drop hints about his financial troubles. He spoke of selling off art pieces, of downsizing to a smaller home. All the while, he watched Addison carefully, noting how her demeanor changed, how her visits became shorter and less frequent. Finally, the day came when Addison arrived for their session, looking flustered and apologetic. "Mr. Blackwell," she began, not quite meeting his eyes, "I'm afraid I have some news." Edward feigned surprise. "Oh, what is it, my dear?" Addison twisted her hands together nervously. "I've been offered a position at a clinic in the city. It's a wonderful opportunity, but it would mean I can't continue our sessions." Edward nodded slowly, as if processing the information. "I see. Well, we must always move forward in life, mustn't we? When do you leave?" Relief flooded Addison's face. "Next week, actually. I hope you understand, Mr. Blackwell. You've meant so much to me, truly." As Edward watched Addison drive away for the last time, he felt a mixture of sadness and vindication. He had confirmed his suspicions, but at the cost of what he had believed was a genuine connection. That evening, as he sat in his study with William and Alexa, Edward finally shared the truth about his financial troubles and Addison's departure. William's face darkened with anger. "I knew it. I knew she was after your money, Grandpa." Alexa, more measured in her response, placed a comforting hand on Edward's arm. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that, Mr. Blackwell. It must have been awful to have your trust betrayed like that." Edward sighed, looking out at the gardens bathed in the golden light of sunset. "Yes, it was difficult. But you know, in a strange way, I'm grateful for the experience." William and Alexa exchanged confused glances. "Grateful?" William asked incredulously. Edward nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "It reminded me of what's truly important in life. It's not the money or the possessions. It's the genuine connections we make, the people who stand by us not for what we have, but for who we are." As the three of them sat there sharing a moment of understanding and genuine affection, Edward felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The mansion no longer felt like a mausoleum of memories, but a home filled with possibility. Little did they know, this was just the beginning. The lessons learned from Addison's deception would set in motion a chain of events that would change all their lives forever. But for now, in this moment, Edward Blackwell felt truly wealthy in all the ways that mattered. The crisp autumn air swept through the gardens of Oakwood Manor, carrying with it the scent of fallen leaves and the promise of change. Edward Blackwell stood at his study window, watching as the groundskeeper raked the colorful foliage into neat piles. The events of the past few months weighed heavily on his mind, but there was a newfound resolve in his steely grey eyes. "Mr. Blackwell?" Mary's gentle voice interrupted his reverie. "Mr. William and Miss Alexa are here to see you." Edward turned, a genuine smile lighting up his face. "Thank you, Mary. Please send them in." As William and Alexa entered the study, Edward couldn't help but marvel at the contrast between them and Addison. Where Addison's presence had once filled him with a misplaced sense of hope, William and Alexa brought with them a warmth that felt real and unassuming. "Grandpa," William said, embracing Edward, "how are you feeling today?" "I'm quite well, thank you," Edward replied, gesturing for them to sit. "In fact, I've been doing some thinking." Alexa leaned forward, her brow furrowed with concern. "Is everything all right, Mr. Blackwell?" Edward nodded, his expression turning serious. "Yes, my dear, but recent events have made me realize that it's time for some changes around here." He paused, collecting his thoughts. "I've decided to extend my little experiment." William's eyes widened. "You mean continue pretending to be in financial trouble? But why, Grandpa? Addison's gone now." Edward settled into his leather armchair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Addison may be gone, but she's made me realize something important. I need to know who I can truly trust, not just with my money, but with my legacy." Alexa and William exchanged glances, clearly uncertain about where this was heading. "Mr. Blackwell," Alexa began cautiously, "I hope you know that we're here for you regardless of your financial situation." Edward's eyes softened as he looked at the young woman. "I know, my dear, and that's precisely why I need to do this. It's not just about you two. It's about my children, my extended family, even the staff here at Oakwood Manor. I need to see who will stand by me when they believe I have nothing left to offer but myself." William leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "I understand, Grandpa, but don't you think it's a bit extreme?" Edward chuckled, a sound tinged with both amusement and sadness. "Perhaps. But at my age, William, I don't have the luxury of time to discern people's true natures slowly. This way, I'll know for certain." As Edward outlined his plan, Alexa and William listened intently, their expressions a mix of concern and grudging admiration. The plan was indeed ambitious. Edward would gradually sell off his assets, downsizing his lifestyle and letting it be known that his fortune had been lost through a series of bad investments. "I'll need your help, of course," Edward said, looking at them both. "Can I count on you to keep this secret?" Without hesitation, both William and Alexa nodded. "Of course, Grandpa," William said firmly. "Whatever you need." Alexa reached out, placing her hand on Edward's. "We're with you, Mr. Blackwell, all the way." As the weeks passed, Edward's plan began to unfold. Rumors of his financial troubles spread through the community like wildfire. The first to react were his society friends, the ones who had always been eager to be seen at Oakwood Manor's lavish parties. Their invitations became less frequent, their calls shorter and more awkward. Edward watched it all with a mixture of sadness and grim satisfaction. Each cancelled dinner, each hesitant conversation, only served to confirm what he had long suspected. Many of his so-called friends had been more interested in his wealth than in his company. The real test, however, came when he began to reach out to his children. Edward had Mary arrange a series of video calls, knowing that face-to-face conversations would make it harder for them to brush off his troubles. The first call was with Elizabeth, his eldest. As her image appeared on the screen, Edward could see the New York skyline behind her, a reminder of the busy life she led. "Dad," Elizabeth said, her tone clipped and professional. "This is unexpected. Is everything all right?" Edward put on his best worried expression. "Well, Elizabeth, I'm afraid I have some rather difficult news. You see, I've run into some financial troubles." As Edward explained his fabricated financial woes, he watched Elizabeth's face carefully. He saw the flicker of disbelief, quickly replaced by calculation. "Dad," Elizabeth interrupted, "I'm so sorry to hear this, but surely there must be something we can do. Have you spoken to Thomas? Perhaps he could help you restructure your investments." Edward shook his head sadly. "I'm afraid it's beyond that point, Elizabeth. I may even have to sell Oakwood Manor." The sharp intake of breath from Elizabeth told Edward everything he needed to know. Her next words confirmed it. "Sell Oakwood? But Dad, that's our family home. What about our inheritance?" The word hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Edward felt a pang in his chest, realizing that his daughter's first thought was not for his well-being, but for her potential loss. "I'm sorry, Elizabeth," he said softly. "I know this must be a shock. I just thought you should know." The call ended shortly after, with Elizabeth making vague promises to look into things and see what can be done. As the screen went dark, Edward leaned back in his chair, feeling every one of his 75 years. Similar scenes played out with his other children. Michael and Christopher, the twins, reacted with a mixture of disbelief and thinly veiled annoyance. Sarah, calling from her Paris studio, seemed more concerned about whether she would still receive her monthly allowance. And Thomas, the financial whiz, bombarded Edward with questions about his investment strategies, more interested in the how than the why. As the days turned into weeks, Edward noticed a distinct change in his interactions with his children. The already infrequent calls became even rarer. When they did call, the conversations were short and awkward, filled with empty platitudes and hasty excuses to end the chat. It was during this time that Edward's bond with William and Alexa grew stronger. They became his confidants, offering support and companionship as he navigated the choppy waters of his self-imposed test. One crisp afternoon, as the three of them walked through the gardens, William broached a subject that had been on his mind. "Grandpa," he began hesitantly, "I've been thinking about your plan. Don't you think it might be time to tell everyone the truth? It's been weeks, and well, it's hard to see you go through this." Edward paused, leaning on his cane as he considered his grandson's words. "I appreciate your concern, William, but I'm not quite finished yet. There's still more to learn, I think." Alexa, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. "Mr. Blackwell, if you don't mind me asking, what exactly are you hoping to achieve with all this?" Edward's gaze swept over the autumn landscape, taking in the vibrant reds and golds of the changing leaves. "You know, Alexa, when you get to my age, you start thinking about your legacy, not just the money or the property, but what you'll leave behind in the hearts and minds of those you care about." He turned to face them both, his eyes shining with a mixture of determination and vulnerability. "I want to know that when I'm gone, the people I leave behind will honor not just my name, but the values I've tried to live by. Honesty, compassion, loyalty. These are the things that truly matter." William and Alexa exchanged glances, a new understanding dawning on their faces. "So this isn't just about exposing who's after your money," William said slowly. "It's about finding out who shares your values." Edward nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "Exactly, my boy. And perhaps in the process teaching a valuable lesson to those who've lost sight of what's truly important." As they continued their walk, the conversation turned to lighter topics, but Edward's words lingered in the air. Unbeknownst to William and Alexa, this was just the beginning of Edward's grand plan. The wheels were in motion for something far more significant than a simple test of loyalty. Back in the manor, Edward retreated to his study, where he spent increasing amounts of time. To William and Alexa, it seemed as though he was simply avoiding the painful reality of his strained family relationships. In truth, Edward was meticulously planning the next phase of his legacy. Late one night, as the manor slept, Edward sat at his desk, penning letters and making phone calls to his most trusted advisors. His lawyer, Mr. Harrington, had been sworn to secrecy, helping Edward set up a complex series of trusts and legal arrangements. "Are you sure about this, Edward?" Mr. Harrington asked during one of their late-night calls. "It's quite an elaborate scheme." Edward's voice was firm as he replied, "I've never been more certain of anything in my life, James. This is how I want it done." As the autumn days grew shorter and the nights longer, Edward's plan continued to unfold. The staff at Oakwood Manor, loyal to a fault, played their parts perfectly. Mary and Helen, though concerned for Edward's well-being, followed his instructions to gradually reduce the household staff and cut back on expenses. It was during this time that Edward received an unexpected call from Addison. Her voice, once so warm and engaging, now held a note of hesitation. "Mr. Blackwell," she began, "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I heard about your financial troubles and I wanted to check in." Edward's grip tightened on the phone. "So that's very kind of you, Miss Parker. As you can imagine, it's been a difficult time." There was a pause before Addison continued, her words carefully chosen. "I was wondering if there was anything I could do to help. Perhaps I could come by for a visit. For old time's sake?" The implication was clear. Now that she believed Edward might be desperate, Addison was testing the waters, perhaps hoping to worm her way back into his good graces and his will. "I appreciate the offer, Miss Parker," Edward replied, his tone polite but firm, "but I'm afraid I must decline. I wish you all the best in your new position." As he ended the call, Edward felt a mix of emotions wash over him. Disappointment, certainly, but also a strange sense of closure. Addison's true nature had been confirmed once and for all. The following weekend, as William and Alexa joined Edward for their now regular Sunday dinner, they noticed a change in his demeanor. There was a new energy about him, a glint in his eye that spoke of purpose. "Is everything all right, Grandpa?" William asked as they settled into the dining room. The table, once laden with fine china and elaborate centerpieces, was now set simply, befitting Edward's supposed financial state. Edward smiled, a genuine expression that lit up his entire face. "Yes, William. In fact, I'd say things are better than they've been in a long time." Alexa tilted her head, studying Edward curiously. "You seem different, Mr. Blackwell. Happier somehow." Edward nodded, taking a sip of his water. "I suppose I am. You see, I've come to a decision. It's time to bring this little experiment of ours to an end." William and Alexa exchanged surprised glances. "You mean you're going to tell everyone the truth?" William asked. "Not quite yet," Edward replied, a mischievous twinkle in his eye. "First, we're going to have a little gathering, a family reunion of sorts." As Edward outlined his plan, William and Alexa listened in growing amazement. He intended to invite all of his children, along with a select group of friends and associates, to Oakwood Manor for what he would call a farewell gathering. "I'll tell them that I'm selling the manor," Edward explained, "that this will be their last chance to say goodbye to their childhood home. And then, my dears, we'll see who shows up and how they behave when they think it's their last chance to secure a piece of the Blackwell fortune." Alexa's brow furrowed with concern. "But, Mr. Blackwell, isn't that a bit cruel? To get their hopes up only to dash them?" Edward's expression softened as he looked at the young woman. "Perhaps, my dear, but sometimes a hard lesson is the only one that truly sticks. And who knows, perhaps some of them will surprise us." As the dinner progressed, Edward shared more details of his plan. He had already instructed Mr. Harrington to send out the invitations, crafted to create a sense of urgency and finality. The gathering would take place in 1 month's time, giving everyone ample opportunity to make arrangements to attend. "And what happens after the gathering, Grandpa?" William asked, leaning forward intently. "Will you reveal the truth then?" Edward's smile held a hint of mystery. "In a manner of speaking, yes. But there's more to it than that. You see, I've been working on something, a way to ensure that my legacy is preserved in the way I see fit." As the evening wore on, Edward found himself filled with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The pain of his children's indifference and Addison's betrayal was still there, a dull ache in his chest, but it was overshadowed by the anticipation of what was to come. Later that night, after William and Alexa had gone home, Edward stood once again at the window of his study. The grounds of Oakwood Manor were bathed in moonlight, the trees casting long shadows across the lawn. In just 1 month, these same grounds would be filled with people, each harboring their own motives and expectations. Edward's gaze fell on the family portrait hanging on the wall. The smiling faces of his children, frozen in time, looked back at him. For a moment he felt a pang of doubt. Was he doing the right thing? Was this elaborate plan truly necessary? But then he remembered the cold calculation in Elizabeth's voice, the disinterest in Michael and Christopher's tones, the self-absorption of Sarah, and the clinical detachment of Thomas. He thought of Addison's manipulative kindness and the fair-weather friends who had disappeared at the first sign of trouble. No, Edward decided, steeling his resolve. This was necessary, not just for him, but for all of them. It was time they remembered what truly mattered in life. With a newfound sense of determination, Edward moved to his desk and began to write. The words flowed easily, filled with the wisdom of his years and the love he still held for his family despite everything. This would be his true legacy, he realized. Not the money or the property, but the lessons he hoped to impart. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, Edward finally set down his pen. The pages before him held the key to everything, his hopes, his disappointments, and his final gift to those he loved. With a deep breath, he carefully folded the pages and sealed them in an envelope. On the front, in his elegant handwriting, he simply wrote, "To be opened when the time is right." The stage was set. In 1 month's time, the true nature of those around him would be revealed, and Edward Blackwell's legacy would be secured, for better or for worse. As he finally retired to bed, exhausted but exhilarated, Edward couldn't help but feel that the best was yet to come. The turning point had arrived, and with it, the promise of revelation, redemption, and perhaps, just perhaps, a chance to rebuild the connections that had been lost along the way. The weeks leading up to the farewell gathering at Oakwood Manor were a whirlwind of activity, punctuated by moments of quiet introspection for Edward Blackwell. As the autumn chill gave way to the first frosts of winter, Edward found himself increasingly aware of the passage of time, not just in the changing seasons, but in the aches of his aging body and the weight of his impending decision. One crisp morning, as Edward stood on the terrace overlooking the frost-covered gardens, he was struck by a sudden, sharp pain in his chest. Gasping, he clutched at the railing, his vision blurring momentarily. The episode passed quickly, but it left him shaken. "Mr. Blackwell," Mary's concerned voice came from behind him. "Are you all right? Shall I call the doctor?" Edward straightened, forcing a smile. "No need to fuss, Mary. Just a little indigestion, I'm sure." But as he made his way back inside, leaning more heavily on his cane than usual, Edward couldn't shake the feeling that his time was running shorter than he'd anticipated. The realization brought with it a newfound urgency to his plans. Later that day, as William arrived for their weekly chess game, Edward found himself studying his grandson with new eyes. The young man's eager smile and kind eyes reminded Edward so much of Madeline that it made his heart ache. "Checkmate," William declared triumphantly, moving his queen into position. "That's 2 games in a row, Grandpa. Are you feeling all right?" Edward chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "Just fine, my boy. Perhaps I'm just distracted by thoughts of our upcoming gathering." William's expression turned serious. "About that, Grandpa. Are you sure you want to go through with this? It's not too late to call it off." Edward reached across the chessboard, patting William's hand. "I appreciate your concern, William, but this is something I need to do, not just for myself, but for all of you." As they reset the board for another game, Edward decided to broach a subject he'd been considering for some time. "William, I've been thinking. You've become such an important part of my life these past months. I was wondering if you'd consider moving into Oakwood Manor. There's certainly plenty of room and I'd enjoy the company." William's eyes widened in surprise. "Move in? But Grandpa, what about your financial troubles and my apartment in the city?" Edward waved his hand dismissively. "Don't worry about the finances. As for your apartment, well, you could keep it for when you need to be in the city, but I'd like to have you here if you're willing." The smile that spread across William's face was answer enough. "I'd be honored, Grandpa. Truly." As they continued their game, the conversation flowed easily between them, touching on William's work, his hopes for the future, and his growing friendship with Alexa. Edward found himself opening up as well, sharing stories of his youth and his life with Madeline that he'd never told anyone before. "You know," Edward said thoughtfully, moving his bishop across the board, "your grandmother always said that family was the most precious thing in the world, more valuable than any fortune." William nodded, his expression serious. "She sounds like she was an amazing woman. I wish I could have known her better." Edward smiled, a faraway look in his eyes. "She would have adored you, William, just as I do." The words hung in the air between them, filled with unspoken emotion. William reached out, squeezing his grandfather's hand. No further words were needed. As the days passed, Edward found himself spending more and more time with William and Alexa. The young woman had become a fixture at Oakwood Manor, her bright smile and kind heart bringing warmth to the old house that it hadn't known in years. One evening, as the 3 of them sat in the library after dinner, Alexa brought up a subject that had been on her mind. "Mr. Blackwell," she began hesitantly, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but why haven't you told your children the truth? About your finances, I mean?" Edward sighed, setting down his book. "It's a fair question, my dear. The truth is, I'm not sure they'd believe me if I did. Or worse, they might believe me and simply go back to treating me as their personal bank account." William leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "But surely they care about you, Grandpa. Beyond the money, I mean." Edward's smile was tinged with sadness. "I'd like to believe that, William. But their actions over the years, well, they've spoken louder than any words could." Alexa's voice was soft as she asked, "Do you think they might surprise you? At the gathering, I mean." Edward considered her words carefully. "I suppose anything's possible, but I've learned not to expect too much. It's safer that way." As the conversation continued, delving into the complexities of family relationships and the true meaning of loyalty, Edward found himself marveling at the wisdom and compassion of these 2 young people. They had shown him more genuine care and understanding in the past few months than his own children had in years. Later that night, alone in his study, Edward pulled out the envelope containing the letter he'd written. He read it over carefully, making small adjustments here and there. As he worked, he couldn't help but reflect on how much his perspective had changed since he'd first put pen to paper. The bitterness and disappointment that had initially fueled his plan had been tempered by the genuine connections he'd formed with William and Alexa. He realized now that his legacy wasn't just about teaching his children a lesson. It was about ensuring that the values he held dear, compassion, loyalty, and unconditional love, would live on long after he was gone. With this new understanding, Edward made a decision. He picked up his phone and dialed a familiar number. "James, it's Edward. I need to make some changes to the arrangements we discussed. Can you come by the manor tomorrow?" The next day, Mr. Harrington arrived early, his briefcase bulging with legal documents. As they sat in Edward's study, the lawyer listened intently to his client's new instructions. "Are you absolutely certain about this, Edward?" Mr. Harrington asked, his pen poised over the papers. "It's quite a significant change." Edward nodded, his expression resolute. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life, James. This is how I want it done." As Mr. Harrington made the necessary adjustments, Edward felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He was no longer simply reacting to his children's behavior or Addison's betrayal. He was taking control of his legacy, shaping it into something that truly reflected his values and hopes for the future. With the legal matters settled, Edward turned his attention to the practical aspects of the upcoming gathering. He worked closely with Mary and Helen to plan every detail, from the menu to the seating arrangements. Despite the pretense of financial troubles, he was determined that this event would be memorable for all the right reasons. As the day of the gathering drew nearer, Edward found himself filled with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. The RSVPs had trickled in, each one a small revelation. His children, predictably, had all confirmed their attendance, their messages filled with thinly veiled concern about the state of their inheritance. What surprised Edward were the responses from some of the other invitees. Old friends he hadn't heard from in years wrote heartfelt notes expressing their support, regardless of his financial situation. Even some of the staff who had been let go as part of his downsizing offered to help with the event free of charge. These gestures, small though they might seem, touched Edward deeply. They reminded him that true friendship and loyalty weren't dependent on wealth or status. The night before the gathering, Edward found himself unable to sleep. He made his way down to the kitchen, thinking a cup of tea might settle his nerves. To his surprise, he found Helen there, busy preparing for the next day. "Mr. Blackwell," she exclaimed, startled by his appearance. "Is everything all right?" Edward smiled, easing himself onto a stool at the kitchen island. "Couldn't sleep, I'm afraid. Too much on my mind, I suppose." Helen nodded sympathetically, setting a kettle on the stove. "Big day tomorrow. It'll be good to have the family all together again, won't it?" Edward's smile faltered slightly. "Yes, I suppose it will." Helen, perceptive as always, caught the hesitation in his voice. "Begging your pardon, Mr. Blackwell, but are you sure you're doing the right thing? With this whole charade, I mean." Edward looked at her in surprise. In all the years Helen had worked for him, she'd never questioned his decisions so directly. "I'm not sure I know what you mean, Helen," he said carefully. Helen sighed, turning to face him fully. "Mr. Blackwell, I've worked for this family for over 30 years. I've seen your children grow up, seen the way things have changed, and I can't help but wonder, is all this necessary? Couldn't you just talk to them?" Edward was silent for a long moment, considering her words. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with emotion. "Oh, Helen, if only it were that simple. I've tried talking to them more times than I can count, but they don't listen. They don't see me anymore. They only see the money, the legacy, the Blackwell name." Helen's eyes softened with understanding. She reached out, patting Edward's hand gently. "Well, for what it's worth, Mr. Blackwell, I see you. And I think what you're doing, it might be hard, but maybe it's necessary. Sometimes people need a good shake to see what's right in front of them." Edward felt a lump form in his throat. "Thank you, Helen. That means more than you know." As they sat there in the quiet kitchen, sipping tea and talking softly about years gone by, Edward felt a sense of peace settle over him. Whatever happened tomorrow, he knew he was doing the right thing. Not just for himself, but for his family. Both the one he was born into and the one he had found. The morning of the gathering dawned clear and cold. Edward stood at his bedroom window, watching as the first rays of sunlight glinted off the frost-covered lawn. In just a few hours, Oakwood Manor would be filled with people, each bringing their own expectations and agendas. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called. William entered, already dressed in a sharp suit. "Good morning, Grandpa. How are you feeling?" Edward turned to face his grandson, a warm smile spreading across his face. "I'm feeling ready, I think. It's time to face the music, as they say." William crossed the room, placing a supportive hand on Edward's shoulder. "Whatever happens today, Grandpa, I want you to know that I'm proud of you. It takes a lot of courage to do what you're doing." Edward felt his eyes mist over. He pulled William into a tight embrace, marveling at how this young man had become such an integral part of his life in such a short time. As they broke apart, Edward's expression turned serious. "William, there's something I need to tell you." About today, about my plans. But before he could continue, they were interrupted by Mary's voice calling up the stairs. Mr. Blackwell, the first guests have arrived. Edward patted William's cheek affectionately. We'll talk later, my boy. For now, let's go greet our guests. As they made their way downstairs, Edward felt a surge of nervous energy. This was it. The moment of truth had arrived. Whatever happened in the next few hours would shape the future of the Blackwell family for generations to come. The grand foyer of Oakwood Manor was already buzzing with activity. Edward's children had arrived en masse, their voices echoing off the high ceilings as they greeted each other with forced cheerfulness. Elizabeth, ever the lawyer, was the first to approach Edward. "Dad," she said, air-kissing his cheek. "You're looking, well." The hesitation in her voice was clear, her eyes darting around the room, no doubt assessing what might be left of value. Michael and Christopher, the twins, were next, their handshakes firm, but their smiles not quite reaching their eyes. Sarah hung back, her artistic sensibilities apparently offended by the lack of fresh flowers and other luxurious touches she was accustomed to seeing at Oakwood Manor. Thomas, the financial whiz, wasted no time in getting to the point. "Dad, we need to talk about your investment strategy. I've been looking into some options that could help turn things around." Edward held up a hand, silencing his youngest son. "All in good time, Thomas. For now, let's just enjoy being together as a family. It's been far too long." As more guests arrived, old friends, business associates, even a few of the staff members who had been let go, Edward found himself at the center of a whirlwind of greetings, condolences, and not-so-subtle inquiries about his financial state. Through it all, he maintained a calm demeanor, neither confirming nor denying the rumors of his financial ruin. He watched as his children circulated, their forced smiles and overly solicitous behavior a stark contrast to their usual indifference. Alexa appeared at his elbow, offering him a glass of water. "How are you holding up, Mr. Blackwell?" she asked softly. Edward's smile was genuine as he looked at her. "I'm doing just fine, my dear. In fact, I think I'm rather enjoying myself." As the gathering moved into the grand dining room for lunch, Edward took his place at the head of the table. He looked around at the faces of his family and friends, each lost in their own thoughts and expectations. With a quiet sigh, he realized that the time had come. It was now or never. Edward stood, tapping his glass gently with a spoon. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to him, expectantly. "My dear family and friends," he began, his voice strong and clear. "I want to thank you all for coming today. Your presence here means more to me than you can know." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room, taking in the eager faces of his children, the concerned looks of his old friends, and the supportive smiles of William and Alexa. "I know there have been many rumors and speculations about my financial situation, about the future of Oakwood Manor and the Blackwell legacy." Edward's voice took on a note of gravity. "Today, I intend to put all of those rumors to rest." A hush fell over the room, the tension palpable. Edward could almost hear the collective intake of breath as everyone leaned forward, waiting for his next words. "But before I do," he continued, "I want to share something with you. A story, if you will, about the true meaning of wealth and the lessons I've learned in my 75 years on this earth." And with that, Edward Blackwell began to speak, his words weaving a tapestry of memory and wisdom that would change the course of his family's future forever. The grand dining room of Oakwood Manor fell silent as Edward Blackwell began to speak. The tension in the air was palpable, each guest hanging on his every word, their minds racing with speculation about what was to come. "I've lived a long life," Edward began, his voice steady despite the emotion behind his words. "I've known great joy and deep sorrow. I've built a fortune and, as you all believe, lost it. But through it all, I've learned one undeniable truth. The greatest wealth we can possess isn't measured in dollars and cents, but in the bonds we forge with those around us." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the faces of his children. Elizabeth sat rigid in her chair, her lawyer's mind no doubt already calculating potential outcomes. Michael and Christopher exchanged glances, their usual confidence faltering. Sarah fidgeted with her napkin, her artistic sensibilities clearly ill at ease with the gravity of the moment, and Thomas, the financial whiz, leaned forward, his eyes narrowed in concentration. "When your mother passed," Edward continued, his voice softening at the mention of Madeline, "I felt as though I'd lost everything. The fortune we'd built together seemed meaningless without her by my side. It was then that I realized the true value of family, of connection. He turned his gaze to William and Alexa, who sat side by side, their faces a mixture of support and apprehension. It's a lesson I've been reminded of recently, thanks to some very special people. Edward's children shifted uncomfortably in their seats, no doubt sensing the implied criticism in their father's words. "But I'm getting ahead of myself," Edward said, straightening his shoulders. "You're all here because you've heard rumors of my financial ruin, of the impending sale of Oakwood Manor and the dissolution of the Blackwell fortune." The room collectively held its breath, waiting for the confirmation they all expected. "Those rumors," Edward said, pausing for effect, "are entirely false." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Elizabeth's pen clattered to the table. Thomas's jaw dropped open in shock. "The truth is," Edward continued, his voice gaining strength, "my fortune remains intact. In fact, thanks to some astute investments, it's grown considerably in recent years." The silence that followed was deafening. Then, as if a dam had broken, the room erupted in a cacophony of voices. "But Dad," Elizabeth sputtered, her composure cracking, "why would you lie to us?" Edward held up a hand, silencing the room once more. "I didn't lie, Elizabeth. I simply allowed you all to believe what you wanted to believe, and in doing so, I learned more about each of you than I have in years." He turned to address the room at large. "You see, this gathering isn't just about revealing the state of my finances. It's about something far more important, the future of the Blackwell legacy." With a nod to Mary, who stood discreetly by the door, Edward continued, "If you'll all follow me to the library, there's something I need to show you." As the guests filed out of the dining room, a buzz of confused chatter filled the air. Edward caught sight of a familiar face slipping in through a side door. Addison, her red hair pulled back in a neat bun, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "Ah, Miss Parker," Edward said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "How good of you to join us. Please do come along." Addison's face paled, but she nodded, falling into step behind the group as they made their way to the library. The Blackwell Library was a magnificent room, its walls lined with leather-bound books, its high ceiling adorned with intricate moldings. At the center of the room, a large screen had been set up, connected to a state-of-the-art projector. As everyone found seats, Edward made his way to the front of the room, leaning slightly on his cane. William and Alexa positioned themselves nearby, ready to offer support if needed. "What you're about to see," Edward said, his voice solemn, "is a video testament I recorded several weeks ago. It outlines my wishes for the distribution of my estate and the future of the Blackwell legacy." With another nod to Mary, the lights dimmed and the projector whirred to life. Edward's face appeared on the screen, larger than life. "If you're watching this," the Edward on the screen began, "it means that the time has come for me to reveal the truth about my finances and my intentions for the future of our family." The room was utterly silent as Edward's recorded voice continued. "For years I've watched as the values your mother and I held dear, compassion, integrity, and the importance of family, have been eroded by greed and self-interest. I've seen my children grow distant, more concerned with their inheritance than with the well-being of their father or the legacy we built together." On screen, Edward's expression softened. "But I've also been blessed to discover that true family isn't always defined by blood. In recent months, I've found more love and support from my grandson William and our dear friend Alexa than I have from my own children in years." The camera panned out, revealing that William and Alexa were present for the recording of the testament. They stood on either side of Edward, their presence a clear statement of their importance in his life. "It is with this in mind," the recorded Edward continued, "that I've made the following decisions regarding my estate." The tension in the room was palpable as Edward began to outline his plans. "To my children, Elizabeth, Michael, Christopher, Sarah, and Thomas, I leave a trust fund of $10 million each, to be managed by an independent trustee. This money is to be used for charitable purposes only. You may each choose the causes you wish to support, but you will have no direct access to the funds themselves." Gasps and murmurs of shock rippled through the room. Elizabeth's face had turned an alarming shade of red, while Thomas looked as though he might be ill. "Additionally," the on-screen Edward continued, "each of you will receive a modest monthly stipend, enough to live comfortably but not extravagantly. The continuation of this stipend will be contingent upon your active involvement in the charitable works funded by your trusts." Michael stood abruptly, his face contorted with anger. "This is outrageous. You can't do this to us." The Edward on the screen seemed to anticipate this reaction. "I assure you, Michael, that this arrangement is entirely legal and binding. Mr. Harrington can confirm this." All eyes turned to the lawyer, who nodded solemnly. "Everything is in order and legally unassailable," he confirmed. The recorded testament continued. "To William, my grandson, who has shown me the true meaning of family, I leave a sum of $50 million to be used as he sees fit. Additionally, he will inherit Oakwood Manor, with the understanding that it will be used not just as a private residence, but as a community center for underprivileged youth." William's eyes widened in shock, his hand reaching out to grasp Alexa's for support. "To Alexa," Edward's voice continued, "whose kindness and compassion have been a beacon of light in my life, I leave a sum of $25 million. I also establish a foundation in her name, dedicated to supporting young artists and musicians, with an initial endowment of $100 million. Alexa gasped, tears welling up in her eyes. She looked at the real Edward, who stood watching the proceedings with a small smile, and mouthed a silent "thank you." "The remainder of my estate," the on-screen Edward said, "will be used to establish the Madeleine Blackwell Foundation, named in honor of my late wife. This foundation will focus on promoting family counseling, support for the elderly, and programs that bridge generational gaps." As the video continued, outlining the specific terms and conditions of these bequests, the room erupted into chaos. Elizabeth was on her feet, shouting about contesting the will. Thomas had his phone out, frantically typing, no doubt trying to find a loophole. Sarah had burst into tears, while Michael and Christopher argued loudly about the unfairness of it all. Through it all, Edward stood calmly at the front of the room, watching as his plan unfolded. William and Alexa moved closer to him, forming a protective barrier against the storm of emotions swirling around them. As the video testament came to an end, the screen went dark and the lights came up. Edward raised his hand, calling for silence. "I understand that this comes as a shock to many of you," he said, his voice cutting through the din. "But before you say anything you might regret, I want you to consider something. This arrangement isn't a punishment. It's an opportunity." He looked at each of his children in turn. "For years, you've lived in the shadow of the Blackwell fortune, allowing it to define you. Now you have the chance to define yourselves, to make a real difference in the world, not because of your name or your wealth, but because of your actions." Edward's gaze softened as he continued. "I love each of you. You are my children, and nothing will ever change that. But love doesn't mean enabling behavior that ultimately harms you. It means challenging you to be the best versions of yourselves." The room fell silent as Edward's words sank in. Even Elizabeth, who had been on the verge of another outburst, seemed to deflate, sinking back into her chair. It was at this moment that Addison, who had been lurking at the back of the room, chose to make her move. She stepped forward, her face a mask of contrition. "Mr. Blackwell," she began, her voice honeyed with false sincerity, "I know I wasn't explicitly invited to this gathering, but I felt I had to come. I've been so worried about you, and I wanted to offer my support no matter what your financial situation might be." Edward turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Is that so, Miss Parker? How very kind of you." Addison nodded eagerly, taking another step forward. "Yes, of course. Our time together meant so much to me. I've missed our talks, our connection. I was hoping we might reconnect, regardless of any changes in your circumstances." A ripple of confusion passed through the room. Those who didn't know Addison looked puzzled, while William and Alexa exchanged knowing glances. Edward smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Miss Parker, your concern is touching, truly, but I'm afraid you've misunderstood the situation entirely." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small nondescript box. "I have something for you, Addison. A parting gift, if you will." Addison's eyes lit up with barely concealed greed as she reached for the box. Opening it eagerly, her expression quickly changed to one of confusion as she pulled out a small cold object. I don't understand," she stammered, holding up what appeared to be a USB drive. Edward's voice was cold as he explained, "That, Miss Parker, contains a recording of every conversation we've had over the past months, including, I might add, your not-so-subtle attempts to insinuate yourself into my will." Addison's face drained of color. But that's not... I never... "Oh, but you did," Edward interrupted. You see, I may be old, Addison, but I'm far from foolish. I recognized your game from the start. I simply played along to see how far you would go." He turned to address the room at large. "Miss Parker here thought she could manipulate an old man into leaving her his fortune. She saw me as an easy mark, a lonely old fool desperate for companionship." Addison was shaking her head frantically, tears streaming down her face. "No, that's not true. I cared about you, Mr. Blackwell, I really did." Edward's expression softened slightly. "Perhaps in your way you did, but your actions speak louder than your words, my dear. That drive contains enough evidence to end your career as a physiotherapist. I have no intention of using it, unless you force my hand." He stepped closer to Addison, his voice low but firm. "Consider this your second chance, Miss Parker. Use it wisely. Leave now and never attempt to prey on vulnerable people again. If I hear of you trying this with anyone else, the contents of that drive will find their way to the proper authorities. Do I make myself clear?" Addison nodded mutely, clutching the USB drive to her chest. Without another word, she turned and fled from the room, the sound of her heels echoing down the hallway. As the door closed behind her, Edward turned back to face his family and friends. The room was utterly silent, everyone stunned by what they had just witnessed. It was William who finally broke the silence. "Grandpa," he said, his voice filled with awe. "That was incredible. But why? Why go through all of this?" Edward smiled, genuine warmth returning to his eyes. "Because, my boy, sometimes people need to see themselves clearly before they can change. And sometimes the only way to make that happen is to hold up a mirror to their actions." He addressed the room at large once more. "What you've witnessed today isn't just about money. It's about values, about the kind of legacy we want to leave behind. Each of you now has a choice to make. Will you continue down the path you've been on, or will you seize this opportunity to become something more?" Edward's gaze lingered on his children, his expression a mixture of hope and challenge. "I'm not naive enough to think that this revelation will instantly transform our relationships. Trust has been broken on both sides, and it will take time to rebuild, but I hope that today can be a new beginning for all of us." As if on cue, Helen entered the room, pushing a cart laden with coffee and pastries. "I thought we might all need a little refreshment," she said, her kind eyes taking in the shell-shocked expressions around her. The tension in the room began to dissipate as people moved towards the cart, the mundane act of pouring coffee and selecting pastries providing a much-needed return to normalcy. Edward made his way over to William and Alexa, who still stood somewhat apart from the others. "I hope you can forgive me for not telling you the full extent of my plans," he said softly. Alexa shook her head, tears glistening in her eyes. "There's nothing to forgive, Mr. Blackwell. What you've done, it's beyond generous. I don't know how to thank you." William nodded in agreement. "Grandpa, I'm honored. But are you sure about this? About Oakwood Manor, I mean." Edward placed a hand on each of their shoulders. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life. You two have shown me what it truly means to be family. I know you'll honor Madeline's memory and continue the legacy we began." As the three of them stood together, Edward felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. He had done what he set out to do. He had held up a mirror to his family, challenging them to be better. Whether they rose to that challenge remained to be seen, but he had given them the opportunity. Across the room, he saw Elizabeth deep in conversation with Mr. Harrington, her expression thoughtful rather than angry. Thomas stood by the window, staring out at the grounds of Oakwood Manor, with a pensive look on his face. Sarah had approached Alexa, tentatively striking up a conversation about the Art Foundation. It wasn't perfect, and it certainly wasn't the end of the story, but it was a beginning. A chance for healing, for growth, for the forging of new bonds and the strengthening of old ones. As Edward looked around at the gathering, his family, both by blood and by choice, he felt a sense of hope that he hadn't experienced in years. Whatever came next, he knew that the Blackwell legacy was in good hands. The future, uncertain though it might be, looked brighter than ever. The days following Edward Blackwell's dramatic revelation at Oakwood Manor were a whirlwind of emotion, introspection, and cautious reconciliation. The grand old house, which had stood as a silent witness to generations of Blackwell triumphs and tribulations, now seemed to breathe with new life, its halls echoing with conversations both difficult and hopeful. Edward, feeling as though a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders, found himself at the center of a storm he had deliberately created. Yet, as he navigated the turbulent waters of family dynamics, he felt a sense of purpose that had been missing for far too long. The morning after the gathering, Edward sat in his study, a cup of steaming tea at his elbow, as he prepared to face the consequences of his actions. A soft knock at the door heralded the arrival of Elizabeth, his eldest. "Dad?" she said, her voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "Do you have a moment?" Edward gestured to the chair across from him. "Of course, Elizabeth. Please sit down." As Elizabeth settled into the chair, Edward noticed the dark circles under her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands. She looked as though she had aged years overnight. "I've been up all night," Elizabeth began, her lawyer's composure cracking slightly, "thinking about everything you said, everything you did, and I owe you an apology." Edward leaned forward, his eyes softening. "Go on," he encouraged gently. Elizabeth took a deep breath. "I've been so focused on my career, on building my own legacy, that I lost sight of what really matters. I convinced myself that my success was a tribute to you and Mum, but the truth is, I was just running away from the responsibility of being part of this family." Tears welled up in her eyes as she continued. "When I heard the rumors about your financial troubles, my first thought wasn't about your well-being. It was about how it would affect me, my status, my future. I'm ashamed of that, Dad. I'm so ashamed." Edward reached across the desk, taking his daughter's hand in his. "Elizabeth, my dear, the fact that you can recognize that you're here now saying these things, that's the first step towards healing." For the first time in years, Edward saw a glimmer of the little girl Elizabeth had once been, the one who had looked up at him with adoration and trust. "I want to do better, Dad," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want to be the daughter you and Mom raised me to be." As father and daughter talked, really talked, for what felt like the first time in decades, Edward felt a spark of hope ignite in his chest. It wouldn't be easy, and there was still a long road ahead, but it was a start. Similar scenes played out throughout the day as Edward's other children sought him out, each grappling with their own realizations and regrets. Michael and Christopher, the twins who had always relied on their unity as a shield, came to Edward together. Their usual bravado was gone, replaced by a humility that Edward had feared they'd lost forever. "We've been idiots, Dad," Michael said bluntly, always the more outspoken of the two. Christopher nodded in agreement. "We thought we had it all figured out. That success in our careers meant we were honoring your legacy. But we were wrong." Edward listened as his sons talked about their plans to use their trust to make a real difference in the world. Michael spoke passionately about setting up free clinics in underserved areas, while Christopher outlined ideas for using technology to bridge educational gaps in rural communities. "We can't change the past," Christopher said, "but we hope you'll give us the chance to prove ourselves going forward." Edward felt a lump form in his throat as he looked at his boys, seeing in them echoes of the men he and Madeline had always hoped they'd become. "Of course," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "That's all I've ever wanted." Sarah, always the most sensitive of his children, was a mess of tears and apologies when she finally worked up the courage to face her father. Her artistic temperament, which had so often been a source of conflict between them, now seemed to give her a unique perspective on the situation. "I've been living in a self-imposed exile," she admitted, twisting a paintbrush in her hands as she spoke. "I convinced myself that you and Mom never understood my passion for art, that I had to get away to truly express myself. But I was wrong, wasn't I? You always supported me, in your own way." Edward nodded, remembering the art supplies he and Madeline had gifted Sarah every birthday and Christmas, the proud display of her earliest works that had adorned his office for years. "I want to use the foundation you've set up," Sarah continued, a spark of excitement entering her voice. "Not just to support young artists, but to bring art to communities that don't have access to it, to show people the power of creativity to heal and unite." As Edward listened to his daughter's plans, he felt a sense of wonder at the transformation taking place before his eyes. The entitled, self-absorbed children he had despaired of had begun to give way to thoughtful, passionate adults eager to make a difference in the world. Thomas, the youngest and perhaps the most deeply affected by Edward's revelation, was the last to seek out his father. When he finally appeared in the study doorway, his usual confident demeanor was nowhere to be seen. "Dad," he began, his voice unsteady, "I don't even know where to start. I've been looking at our family, at our wealth, as nothing more than numbers on a spreadsheet. I forgot about the people behind those numbers, the lives we could be impacting. Edward watched as his youngest son, the one who had always seemed most like him in his drive and ambition, struggled to find the right words. "I want to learn," Thomas finally said, meeting his father's eyes. "Not just about finance and investments, but about what it truly means to be a Blackwell. About the values you and Mum built this family on. Will you teach me?" The question, so simple yet so profound, brought tears to Edward's eyes. "Oh, Thomas," he said, rising from his chair to embrace his son, "nothing would make me happier." As the days turned into weeks, Oakwood Manor underwent a transformation that was both physical and spiritual. William and Alexa, still somewhat dazed by the enormity of the responsibility Edward had placed on their shoulders, threw themselves into the task of reimagining the grand old house as a community center. Edward watched with pride as the young couple worked tirelessly, consulting with architects, social workers, and community leaders to create a space that would truly serve the needs of underprivileged youth while honoring the Blackwell legacy. One sunny afternoon, as Edward walked the grounds with William and Alexa, he couldn't help but marvel at the changes taking place. "We're thinking of converting the East Wing into dormitories," William explained, gesturing towards the house. "For kids who need a safe place to stay, you know?" Alexa nodded enthusiastically. "And the ballroom would make an amazing performance space. We could host concerts, plays, art exhibitions." As they talked, their excitement palpable, Edward felt a warmth spread through his chest. This, he realized, was what he had always hoped for Oakwood Manor. Not a mausoleum to past glories, but a living, breathing space that could make a real difference in people's lives. "You two never cease to amaze me," Edward said, his voice filled with pride. "Madeline would have loved this, you know. She always said this house was too big for just one family." Alexa slipped her arm through Edward's, giving it a gentle squeeze. "We couldn't do any of this without you, Mr. Blackwell. Your vision, your generosity, it's overwhelming, really." William nodded in agreement. "We just hope we can live up to the trust you've placed in us, Grandpa." Edward looked at the two young people beside him, seeing in them the future he had always hoped for. "My dears," he said softly, "you already have." As the weeks turned into months, the true impact of Edward's actions began to ripple out beyond the confines of Oakwood Manor. His children, initially shocked and resentful of the conditions placed on their inheritances, gradually began to embrace the challenge their father had set before them. Elizabeth, her legal skills now turned towards advocating for social justice, found a new sense of purpose in her work. Michael and Christopher, working together for the first time since childhood, made significant strides in bringing quality healthcare and education to underserved communities. Sarah's Art Foundation quickly gained recognition for its innovative programs, bringing creativity and hope to places that had long been overlooked. And Thomas, perhaps the most transformed of all, threw himself into learning about ethical investment and social entrepreneurship. He worked closely with Mr. Harrington, not to find loopholes in his father's will, but to understand how to use financial tools to create lasting positive change in the world. Edward, watching all of this unfold, felt a sense of peace and fulfillment that he hadn't experienced in years. The Blackwell legacy, which he had feared might die with him, was being reborn in ways he could never have imagined. One evening, as Edward sat in his study, reflecting on the whirlwind of changes the past few months had brought, he was struck by a bittersweet realization. He picked up the framed photo of Madeline that had been his constant companion for so many years. "Oh, Maddie," he said softly, tracing her smiling face with a finger. "I wish you could see this. I wish you could see what our family has become." A soft knock at the door interrupted his reverie. "Come in," he called, setting the photo back on his desk. Mary entered, a gentle smile on her face. "Mr. Blackwell, the family is gathering in the living room. They're asking for you." Edward raised an eyebrow in surprise. "All of them?" Mary nodded, her eyes twinkling. "Yes, sir, all of them." As Edward made his way to the living room, leaning a bit more heavily on his cane than he would have liked to admit, he couldn't help but feel a flutter of nervousness in his stomach. Despite the progress of the past few months, having all of his children together in one room was still a rare occurrence. But as he entered the room, the scene before him took his breath away. His children, all 5 of them, were there, along with William and Alexa. They were laughing, talking animatedly, the tension that had characterized their interactions for so long noticeably absent. Elizabeth was the first to notice his arrival. "Dad!" she called out, her face lighting up. "Come join us. We were just talking about the old days." As Edward settled into his favorite armchair, he found himself at the center of a circle of warmth and affection. His children shared stories of their childhood, reminiscing about family vacations and holiday traditions, many of which Edward had feared were long forgotten. "Remember that time Dad tried to teach us all how to sail?" Michael said, laughing. "I thought we were going to sink for sure." "Or the Christmas when Mum decided we should all learn to ice skate," Sarah added, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "Poor Dad spent more time on his backside than on his feet." As the laughter and stories flowed, Edward felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. This, he realized, was what he had been missing for so long. Not the grand gestures or the material success, but the simple joy of being surrounded by family, of sharing memories and creating new ones. William, noticing his grandfather's emotion, raised his glass. "I think we should make a toast," he said, his voice carrying over the chatter. "To Grandpa Edward, who had the courage to shake us all up and remind us what really matters." As glasses were raised and words of love and gratitude filled the air, Edward felt a presence beside him. Looking up, he saw Alexa, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Mr. Blackwell," she said softly, "I hope you know how much you've changed all of our lives, not just with your generosity, but with your wisdom and your love." Edward reached out, taking her hand in his. "My dear," he replied, his voice thick with emotion, "you and William have given me the greatest gift of all. You've helped me rebuild my family." As the evening wore on, Edward found himself overwhelmed by a sense of gratitude and joy. The road ahead would not be without its challenges, he knew. Old habits and hurts would take time to fully heal, but looking around at the faces of his loved ones, he felt a certainty deep in his bones that the Blackwell family was on the right path at last. Later that night, as Edward prepared for bed, he paused by the window, looking out over the moonlit grounds of Oakwood Manor. The grand old house, which had stood as a silent witness to generations of Blackwell history, seemed to glow with new purpose. In the distance, he could see the scaffolding around the east wing, where work on the new community center was well underway. Closer to the house, the gardens that had once been meticulously manicured showpieces were being transformed into vegetable plots and outdoor classrooms. Edward smiled to himself, imagining the life and energy that would soon fill these grounds. Children laughing, learning, growing, families finding hope and support, a legacy not of wealth and status, but of compassion and positive change. As he turned away from the window, his gaze fell on Madeline's portrait hanging above the fireplace. In the soft lamplight, her smile seemed more radiant than ever, her eyes filled with the love and warmth he remembered so well. "We did it, Maddie," Edward whispered, his voice barely audible. "Our family, our legacy. It's safe, and it's so much more than we ever dreamed it could be." With a heart full of peace and hope for the future, Edward Blackwell closed his eyes and drifted off to sleep, knowing that whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, the foundations he had laid would endure for generations to come. 5 years had passed since Edward Blackwell's fateful gathering at Oakwood Manor. The grand old house, once a symbol of isolated wealth, now bustled with life and purpose. On a warm summer evening, the sprawling grounds were filled with laughter, music, and the excited chatter of children and adults alike. William Blackwell, now 28, stood on the terrace overlooking the annual community fair that had become a beloved tradition. Beside him, his wife Alexa cradled their newborn daughter Madeline, named after the grandmother she would never meet, but whose spirit lived on in the very foundations of the transformed Oakwood Manor. "Can you believe how far we've come?" Alexa mused, her eyes scanning the joyful scene before them. Colorful booths dotted the lawn, offering everything from local crafts to educational workshops. Children darted between activity stations, their faces painted with bright designs. In the distance, the new amphitheater hosted a youth orchestra, their music floating on the evening breeze. William shook his head, a smile playing on his lips. "Sometimes I still think I'll wake up and find it was all a dream," he admitted. "But then I look at all of this, at you and little Maddie, and I know it's real." Grandpa Edward's vision, brought to life. As if summoned by his name, Edward appeared in the doorway, his steps slower now but his eyes as bright and keen as ever. At 80, he had become a beloved figure in the community, known affectionately as Grandpa to all the children who passed through Oakwood's programs. "There's my great-granddaughter," Edward cooed, gently taking the baby from Alexa's arms. "Are you enjoying your first Oakwood fair, little one?" The scene was interrupted by the arrival of Thomas, the youngest of Edward's children, who bounded up the terrace steps with characteristic energy. "Dad, Will, Alexa, you've got to come see this," he exclaimed. "The kids from the coding workshop are demonstrating their projects. It's incredible what they've accomplished in just a few months." As they made their way down to the fair, Edward couldn't help but marvel at the transformation in his son. Thomas, once driven solely by financial gain, now poured his considerable talents into developing programs that taught underprivileged youth valuable tech skills. His eyes shone with genuine passion as he described the projects, a far cry from the cold calculations of his past. They passed by a booth where Elizabeth was engaged in an animated discussion with a group of teenagers. Her law practice, once focused on corporate giants, now specialized in advocacy for foster children and at-risk youth. She caught her father's eye and waved, excusing herself to join the family. "Dad," she said, embracing Edward warmly, "I was just telling these kids about the new mentorship program we're launching. I think it's going to make a real difference." Edward felt a swell of pride. "I have no doubt it will, my dear." As they continued their tour of the fair, they encountered Michael and Christopher, who were overseeing a mobile health clinic that provided free checkups and vaccinations to community members. The twins, once fiercely competitive, now worked in seamless tandem, their medical skills complementing each other perfectly. Sarah's art therapy tent was a riot of color and creativity, filled with children and adults alike, expressing themselves through paint, clay, and various other mediums. She waved to her family, her smile radiant as she guided a young boy's hand in creating a vibrant mural. As the evening wore on and the fair began to wind down, the Blackwell family gathered once more on the terrace. The sunset painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, casting a warm glow over Oakwood Manor and its grounds. Edward looked at the faces of his children and grandchildren, each of them now carrying forward a piece of the legacy he and Madeline had begun so many years ago. The wealth that had once threatened to tear them apart had become a force for unity and positive change. "I wish your grandmother could see this," Edward said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "This is what she always dreamed Oakwood could be." William placed a hand on his grandfather's shoulder. "She can see it, Grandpa. Her spirit is in every life we touch, every child we help, every family we support." Alexa nodded in agreement. "The true wealth of the Blackwell family isn't in its bank accounts or property holdings. It's in the love and compassion you've instilled in all of us, the desire to make a real difference in the world." As if to underscore her words, a group of children ran past, laughing and calling out goodbyes. "Thank you, Grandpa Edward," they shouted, waving enthusiastically. "See you next week for story time." Edward waved back, his heart full to bursting. This, he realized, was the truest measure of wealth, not the accumulation of money or possessions, but the ability to touch lives, to leave the world a little better than you found it. As the last rays of sunlight faded, and the stars began to twinkle overhead, Edward Blackwell looked out over the grounds of Oakwood Manor. The grand old house, once a symbol of isolation and privilege, now stood as a beacon of hope and community. The Blackwell fortune, once a source of strife and division, had been transformed into a force for good, touching countless lives in ways that would ripple out for generations to come. In that moment, Edward felt a presence beside him, as real and warm as if she were truly there. He could almost hear Madeline's voice, filled with love and pride. "Well done, my darling. Well done." With tears in his eyes and a smile on his lips, Edward turned to his family, not just those related by blood, but the extended family of staff, volunteers, and community members who had become an integral part of the Oakwood family. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice carrying years of love, struggle, and hard-won wisdom. "Thank you for helping an old man realize that the greatest wealth we can ever possess is the love we give away." As the Blackwell family embraced, their laughter and tears mingling in the cool evening air, the lights of Oakwood Manor glowed warmly, a promise of welcome and hope for all who would come seeking shelter, support, and a chance at a better future. And so the true Blackwell legacy lived on, not in vaults or stock portfolios, but in the hearts and lives of every person touched by their compassion, their generosity, and their unwavering belief in the power of family, both chosen and born. In the end, Edward Blackwell had discovered the most valuable truth of all, that a life rich in love, purpose, and the joy of giving was the greatest fortune one could ever hope to amass, and that, more than any material wealth, was a legacy worth passing on. If this story touched your heart, and you want to keep following inspiring and moving stories, be sure to check out our upcoming videos. Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications to stay updated on new content that can brighten your journey and provide valuable insights. Join us and keep exploring stories that truly matter. I'm sure the next video that pops up on your screen will touch you as well, so click on it now and we'll see you there.